Greetings. Father Mark signing on with the third installment in the course on medieval history. In the last part, we began with the life of Augustine, so we pick up there. In the same year that the Emperor Theodosius outlawed paganism, that's the year 391, St. Augustine was ordained a priest by Bishop St. Leontius Valerius of the city of Hipporegius in Algeria, present-day Algeria, North Africa. This took place very much against his will, as he explained in his letter to the bishop. This is letter number 21 in Augustine's collection. And he requested time after ordination to prepare before embarking on active priestly ministry. So an excerpt from letter 21. This is from section 4, quote, "Perhaps, Your Holiness replies, I wish to know what is lacking to fit you for your office." This is because Augustine didn't want to be, it's like we say, the bishop is, why don't you want to do this? So continuing with Augustine's response. "The things which I lack are so many that I could more easily enumerate the things which I have than those which I desire to have. I may venture to say that I know and unreservedly believe the doctrines pertaining to our salvation, but my difficulty is in the question how I am to use this truth in ministering to the salvation of others, seeking what is profitable, not for myself alone, but for the many, that they may be saved. And perhaps there may be, nay, beyond all question there are, written in the sacred books, counsels by the knowledge and acceptance of which the man of God may so discharge his duties to the church in the things of God, or at least so keep a conscience void of offense in the midst of ungodly men, whether living or dying, as to secure that life for which alone humble and meek Christian hearts sigh is not lost. But how can this be done? Except as the Lord himself tells us, by asking, seeking, knocking, that is, by praying, reading, and weeping. For this I have, by the brethren, made the request, which in this petition I now renew, that a short time, say until Easter, be granted me by your unfeigned and venerable charity. And of course the request was granted. 393, 2 years later, year 393. Only 3 years after the massacre of Thessalonica, and 2 years after Augustine was ordained a priest, the Emperor Theodosius entrusted a foederati with the position of commanding general of the Danube River frontier, opposing incursions from Germanic tribes. This foederati general's name was Stilicho. Ethnically, he was a Vend. That's a Scandinavian tribe, better known to history as the Vandals. Yes, that is where our term Vandal comes from. And it entered our language that way because they were such nice people, and they made such glorious contributions to civilization. Even more significant to the imperial population, Theodosius gave his own niece, Serena, in marriage to Stilicho. They had a son and 2 daughters. On the Danube frontier, one of Stilicho's senior officers was a guy named Alaric. He was commanding a detachment of German Visigoths, also foederati. Stilicho and Alaric, and the relationship between them, are directly responsible for the situation that required Augustine to write the City of God, and therefore make all the contributions to the medieval church that are contained in that book. Stilicho enlisted in the legions at the first opportunity in 382. He proved to be a competent soldier, so rose to officer rank. Alaric was born outside the empire, across the Danube frontier. In 391, he led one of the countless raids into imperial territory that characterized the disintegration of the Western Empire in its last century of life. Essentially, it was a failed state, for 100 years before the actual date, which we'll cover, came. As it happened, Stilicho commanded the Foederati that defeated and captured Alaric in this incursion. The confrontation took place in Thrace. Alaric, as a prisoner, pleaded that his raid had been motivated only by poverty, and he asked for a chance to prove himself. In a decision that changed history, Stilicho agreed, offered Alaric a probationary appointment as a Foederati officer. The following year, 392, on the 15th of May, the corpse of the Western Emperor, Valentinian II, was found hanging in a room in Vienne, which was in Gaul, present-day France. Not Vienna. That's different. That was on the Danube. Vienne is in the Roman Gaul, present-day France. Valentinian's Foederati, Magister Militium, his commander of infantry, was a Frank, another Foederati, Germanic ethnicity, named Arbogast. Arbogast announced that the poor emperor, he was so overcome. He had been sad for a long time, and he just could not find solace. All the things that he used to like, he lost interest in. The music and the poetry, the grape harvest wasn't that good, so the wine didn't taste good, and he just got so depressed that he hanged himself. This was believed by exactly no one in the empire. Before we go into the consequences, who were these people? The Franks. Arbogast was a Frank. Okay, so the Franks were a loose coalition of several Germanic tribes from northwestern Germany. There, if you want to look on today's maps, find the Ems River, EMS, the Ems River. Today, that's near the border of Germany and the Netherlands. The coalition of the different tribes included the Salians, the Ripararians, the Kauski, the Amsavari, the Karuski, the Kamavi. Arbogast, like Stilicho, enlisted in the legions when the opportunity presented as a Foederati. He rose through the ranks to be a commanding officer of infantry along the Rhine River. Stilicho was on the Danube. Okay, so no one believed Arbogast's story. It was obvious that he had murdered Valentinian. The motive became clear when Arbogast had his Foederati recognize as emperor a minor civil servant named Eugenius. The advantage of Eugenius for Arbogast was that Eugenius was ethnically Roman. And now this matters because people are now because of the Foederati coming in, people are now conscious of ethnicity. So Arbogast figured that Eugenius could get support from people who would never support Arbogast himself. What about Eugenius? Why be a stooge for Arbogast? Well, the advantage of Arbogast for Eugenius is that both of them were pagan, and both of them deeply resented Theodosius outlawing paganism or closing all the pagan temples in favor of Christianity. So that was their exchange. Eugenius said, I'll get the imperials on your side if, once you get power, you support me. Once we get power, you support me in reopening the pagan temples. On this basis, a civil war was fought. It culminated in a battle near what is now the Vipava River in present-day Slovenia. On the imperial maps, it was the Frigidus River, so it's the Battle of the Frigidus River. It took place in September 5th and 6th, 394 AD. Stilicho. Arbogast and Eugenius on one side, Theodosius on the other. Serving Theodosius was Stilicho, and serving Stilicho was Alaric at the Battle of the Frigidus River. The Alaric and his Visigoths were stationed in the front line by Stilicho. So they were cannon fodder. Well, they didn't have cannon then, but you know what I mean. They were, just to be, tossed off. Now, Alaric survived the battle, but 10,000 of his men, Visigoths, were wiped out, caught between the two armies. Stilicho had positioned them there because it was a position from which they could not run away, because he didn't trust them. Alaric never forgave Stilicho for what he regarded as the pointless waste of his men. The battle turned out to be a victory for Theodosius. He was able to reunite both halves of the Roman Empire for what turned out to be the last time in history. Eugenius, the pretended Western emperor, was captured and executed. Arbogast committed suicide while on the run to avoid being captured. Stilicho was promoted to supreme commander of infantry and cavalry. Alaric deserted after the battle, and he commenced gathering to his banner disaffected foederati as well as tribal warriors from outside of the empire. In 395, his new warband proclaimed him Rex, or king of the Visigoths. They had no actual territory, but they were inside of the empire. So Alaric led them on a pillaging campaign, raiding and extorting protection money from poorly defended cities. He was able to get away with this for a time because he waited until after the death of the Emperor Theodosius in the pivotal year of 395 AD. This was the year significant for the empire as well as for St. Augustine. By the year 395, Augustine's Bishop Valerius of Hippo Regius, was weakened by age and infirmity. He arranged an invitation to Aurelius, the Bishop of Carthage, and Megalius, the Bishop of Calama, that they visit him in Hippo Regius. So this is a setup. Seminarians, you probably have guessed what this means, but for those who are watching the channel in canon law, there's something that 3 bishops can do. 3 bishops can make another bishop. So this is a setup. The 3 of them then pressured Augustine. Well, anyway, Pisidius, who was Augustine's friend, was there for this. In his Life of Augustine, chapter 8, he explains what happened. So since we're trying to engage these people on their own terms, I'll just read what Pisidius had to say. Quote, "But the blessed and aged Valerius realized that he was aged and very infirm. He communicated by a secret letter to the Bishop of Carthage, the episcopal primate, mentioning the weakness of his body and the burden of his years, and beseeching that Augustine might be ordained bishop of the church of Hippo Regius, because he would not, in that case, then succeed to his office, but would be associated with him as coadjutor bishop." So that means a bishop would be an automatic successor. And what he thus sought and desired, he obtained in a satisfactory answer. Later on, accordingly, when Megalius, Bishop of Calama, and at that time Primate of Numidia, had come at his request to visit the church at Hippo, unexpectedly, to all, the Bishop Valerius made his desire known to the people who happened to be present, and to all the clergy of Hippo. But while all who heard rejoiced and clamored most eagerly that this should be done and accomplished, the presbyter, meaning Augustine, refused to accept the episcopate, contrary to the custom of the church, since his bishop was still living. However, when they had convinced him that this was generally done, and appealed to examples from the churches across the sea, as well as in Africa, though he had been ignorant of it before, under compulsion and constraint, he yielded and accepted the ordination to the higher office. And so it was done. Same year, 395, on the imperial stage, the Emperor Theodosius died on the 17th of January. Never again would both halves of the empire be reunited under one man. Theodosius, ironically, ensured that by dividing the empire between his two sons. The older son got the east. His name was Arcadius. The younger son got the west. His name was Honorius. It is another indication of how swiftly and completely the Foederati had inserted themselves into the imperial establishment. Both heirs were pressured into marrying the daughters of Foederati generals, because these generals, said, of course, we recognize that we're unworthy of this great and high honor, as are our daughters. However, if each of you and your magnificence would stoop to this and grace our daughters with this high honor, then the troops we command could be relied upon to ensure you continue on your throne. Okay, so that's life in a failed state. So Arcadius married the daughter of a Foederati general who was a Frank, German, whereas Honorius married one of the daughters of Stilicho, whom we've already met. The division of the empire from east into west separated Stilicho and Alaric for a time, but Alaric still had a grudge against Stilicho, and Stilicho had a grudge against Alaric because he felt Alaric abandoned him. Here he spared Alaric's life when he had captured him the first time, and now Alaric ran away after the Battle of the Frigidus River, whereas Alaric, believed that Stilicho betrayed him by throwing away the lives of all of his men. So this antipathy continued. Alaric in the east made a deal with some corrupt bureaucrats in the east to be recognized as a general. So he retained his Foederati status, even though he had deserted in the west. He went to the east. He had gathered enough new guys that he made a new Foederati arrangement, and he was recognized as a general, which gave him some income for himself and his men. 3 years later, in 398 AD, a Berber chieftain in North Africa named Gildo, or at least that's the Latin rendering. I mean, we don't know what his actual name, but that's how the Latin ear heard it and wrote it down. This guy proclaimed the region of Africa independent and seceded from the empire. Now, the Romans, of course, they never conquered all of the whole continent. So Roman Africa was the area between the Mediterranean south to the Sahara Desert. The Romans never got further south. They never tried to cross the Sahara. So essentially from Morocco to Egypt in North Africa. Stilicho defeated this guy in battle, and Gildo committed suicide rather than face capture by the Romans. Stilicho then had his own brother-in-law appointed as imperial governor of Africa, meaning that he was the senior imperial official where Augustine lived. Now, this guy's actual base was in Carthage, not Hipporegius, but it was still over a guy. It'd be like the governor of Roman Africa, and the governor's name, Stilicho's brother-in-law, was named Bathanarius. Imagine that name on the birthday cake. Meanwhile, Alaric perceived an opportunity. His men were restless, Even though they were getting some money, as federati, they were bored. These are not the kind of guys to settle down and farm. So with Stilicho in Africa putting down the secession movement, Alaric led his men on a raid into Macedonia, north of Greece, which brought them toward the boundary between the two halves of the empire. Unprepared for the swift victory Stilicho achieved, and therefore startled that Stilicho was able to return and muster an army, Alaric was outmaneuvered and defeated by Stilicho in Macedonia. Alaric escaped. Stilicho won the battle, but Alaric managed to get away, still nursing his grudge, now magnified, because he's humiliated again by Stilicho. 3 years later, in 401, Stilicho had to move the bulk of his troops out of Italy to contain a border incursion across the Danube by the Vandals and the Alans. Alaric saw another opportunity. He seized this chance to invade Italy, to go behind, to go south of, and invade Italy and raid in Italy, while Stilicho was dealing with the Danube frontier. Stilicho returned and caught Alaric laying siege to Mediolanum, which is present-day Milan. Alaric retreated rather than be caught between the walls of Milan and Stilicho's army, but Stilicho pursued him. This is a grudge match. He engaged and defeated Alaric at Palencia and again at Verona. Once again, Alaric defeated, but he managed to escape. He went back east. In 402, where Stilicho had no authority in the east, and where Alaric, through whatever means, probably bribery, had enough members of the Eastern imperial bureaucracy on his side that the Eastern establishment was not going to pursue him. 4 years later, in 405, a Germanic Gothic king named Radagasius led 20,000 Goths. The Goths is also, they're Germanic, but it's like the Franks, it's a collection of other tribes. So these are Alans, Sueves, along with Scandinavian Vends. Led them across the Danube again, continued, crossed the Alps, and invaded Italy with 20,000 men. The situation was so desperate that Stilicho offered freedom to any slave who fought with the army and survived. Even with this, Stilicho was only able to muster 15,000 troops, but he used them more effectively. He engaged and defeated the Goths at Florence, what is now Florence in Tuscany, Italy. Radagasius was captured and executed on August 22nd, 406. Yet, it is an indication of the practices of a federati army, as well as the disintegration of Rome in this period, that 1/3 of the defeated captured Germans, were allowed to enlist in the Roman army as federati, whereas the other 2/3 were sold into slavery to pay the army. Yeah, anyway, okay. The following year, 406, while Stilicho was engaged in hunting down Radagasius, another German chieftain, this one from West Germany, led another invasion, this one across the Rhine River into Roman Gaul, which is now France. He led warriors from the Quadi, the Alemanni, and the Alans. The Rhine frontier was ostensibly defended by federati of the Frank tribes, but they, in 406, were overwhelmed, and the imperial province of Gaul was devastated. They were just unopposed, after the Franks were defeated, unopposed raiding all through France. Perceiving an opportunity, another Roman general, this one in Britain, named Constantine, chose this moment to declare himself emperor. And Alaric chose this moment to invade Illyricum. That's on the eastern side of the Adriatic Sea. So Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, this all was Roman Illyricum. Stilicho had to resort to increasingly desperate means of recruiting or drafting or kidnapping men to fight. This continued until some of them revolted at Ticinum in Italy in 408. This revolt within the army, along with his inability to contain the invasion across the Rhine, enabled political enemies who resented, the status he had in the West, enabled them to turn the Western Emperor Honorius against Stilicho. And they concocted charges, accused him of treason and all kind of other stuff, none of which was true. But they got Honorius, they turned Honorius. And so he had Stilicho arrested and executed on August 22nd, 408. This execution of Stilicho was the trigger for a second ethnically motivated massacre within the empire. The imperial population in Italy erupted into frenzy in cities throughout Italy, rioting and murdering 30,000 wives and children of Foederati, of German and Scandinavian Foederati. If any of the perpetrators imagined that this would drive the Foederati out, the reverse is what actually occurred. Hearing the news, the Foederati troops that had served under Stilicho deserted and sought out Alaric, still raiding and pillaging in Illyricum. They pledged their loyalty to Alaric if he pledged to lead them to get revenge against Rome. So we'll pause there and pick up next time. So anyway, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.